the reality is our job as an auditor is to look for fraud. Can we find every fraud? No, but we need to look for fraud. The mission of the PCAOB is to restore confidence in society regarding our audits. We have lost so much confidence in the public's lost confidence in the auditors just because of all the fraud that's occurred. And so as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley, the goal is to try to restore our integrity to where the public can trust, the public being the banks, the creditors, investors, that they can trust these financial statements again. Repeated revelations of accounting scandals and audit failures have damaged public confidence. The detection of material fraud is a reasonable expectation of users of audited financial statements that the detection of material fraud is a reasonable expectation of users of audited assurance that financial information has not been materially misstated because of fraud. Unless an independent audit can provide this assurance, it has little value to society. So we need to be able to uncover material fraud. Part of what this chapter is to help you see, sometimes it's difficult. Because as you saw in the Dennis Doozy's examples of real-world examples in government, sometimes those individuals that are participating in the fraud are higher up in the chain and have the ability to hide things and make it much harder to discover. Financial statement users' message to the auditors is clear. Auditors must assume a greater responsibility for detecting fraud and assuring users that the financial statements are free from material fraud. Yes?
What chapter is it?
9.
Okay, because for week 11, you've got chapter 11.
You got chapter 11. We don't have 9.
I'm sorry. I will fix this. It's 9 and 10 for 11 and 12. I'm sorry, guys. I did it on the other thing. Sorry about that. I'll make sure it's corrected this evening. Here, let me just do it right now as we speak. How about that? What?
We know where to find it now, so we can follow along. We couldn't find the slide.
I'm sorry. Okay. So, guys, basically, as you've been hearing all along in this course, professional skepticism. Could you tell that Dennis Dicus has that skepticism of what he calls questioning? You know, does that make sense? The skepticism really strengthens our professional objectivity. So we really need to have the mindset of where can fraud occur and how can it occur? This is scary. This is a 2008 study. We're in 2014 today. 7% of revenues are lost as a result of fraud. 7%. That's a lot of money. Estimated at losses of $1 trillion per year. Guys, we could pay down the national debt with all this. Well, I won't even go there. A difficulty occurs in understanding how widespread fraud occurs because frauds are often not reported. They probably happen in all walks of companies, all areas. Those of you that, like in your situation, just seeing another cohort, see how they're just taking money. This doesn't even take into account just the waste. People just abusing, recording time on the clock when they're really not working. Think of how big the various aspects of fraud can occur. One estimate is that 40% of frauds have been discovered but not prosecuted. An additional 40% of frauds have not even been discovered. Employee takes employees take assets from the organization for personal gain, such as theft, stealing money. Frauds can be due to kickbacks, conflict of interest, bribery. Fraudsters use their influence in a transaction to gain personal benefit. I mean, guys, think of how many times there are bids. With companies, they might have bids for various types of projects, and how often you hear of bids being what do you call when two of the companies come together and fix their bids? How many times do you hear of, in a way, that's a form of fraud, because they're raising the price because they work together in order to fix the contract cost. Defalcation can be based on employees, can either be taking money from the company organization, theft, skimming revenues, cash schemes, inventory theft, payroll fraud. Defalcation may create misleading financial statements if stolen assets are reported on the statements. Again, that's why it's so important for auditors to come in to observe that the assets on hand, be it inventory, be it cash, be it whatever the assets are the company has, really are in fact existing, right? They're existing and they're complete. Another way fraud can occur, which is really tough, is when it's so high up at the top, the financial statements are manipulated. That's a lot trickier to resolve, because they have the means to go in and possibly provide the journal entries in order to change the reality of those financial statements. Why does this happen? When we're dealing with upper level management, they can override internal controls. What am I going to do when, right now at school here, I run what's called the professional development funds for faculty. And so they are required to provide me with the receipts, provide me with their signature, all these different guidelines, how the monies are spent. What if Tim Wines, the president, came in and just said, hey, Nancy, he brings in a person, I want this person to get this money. Do I have the ability to say, but President Wines, I need this, this, this? I mean, that's what I better do. But do you see how, when you're up at the top, how though you can somehow evade those strong internal controls that are in place? Do you see the pressure you can get from outsiders to somehow comply with individuals? Misrepresentation or omission of events, transactions, or significant information. A lot of the big frauds or the misstatement of financial statements we've seen in the latest decade really have come from the CEOs or the top management telling the accounting department, let's show something as a sale, even though technically it probably shouldn't have been recorded as one. They manipulate the financial statements so that sales are recorded that boost up their revenues. They can, by the sleight of a hand, kind of click and change the date on certain transactions, which is all the more the importance of, as accountants and as auditors, making sure we do that diligence to perform that audit. So we're going to catch material misstatements, which would include material fraud. Fraudulent financial reporting generally happen because assets get overstated or we understate expenses. One way you can do both at the same time is you take what should be an expense and you treat it as an asset. Do you remember me talking about those cables for WorldCom underneath the waters? How it was basically like a renting of the lines, but they treated it as a capital asset on their books, which totally understated expenses and absolutely overstated the assets. It made them look as though they had a lot more assets, total assets at hand, and much less in revenues. So as you can imagine, they're showing greater profits, they're showing greater assets, when in fact, when those when those corrections were found, you can see how material those numbers were. The assets were reduced equally to what the expenses had to be increased. Historically speaking, the initial purpose of an audit was to detect fraud and trying to look for ways in which employees may be taking assets. One thing that when there's some examples in the book of the whole equity scenario for fraud. I'm showing you some various videos as it relates to fraud. Lessons we are learning. What is it we're learning when we hear these situations? Auditors take risk whenever they do not audit the entire company. You need to audit everything. Auditors need to look at economic assumptions underlying a company's growth. Guys, if there's one thing, I just like that saying, does it make sense? When you see that the company is growing by leaps and bounds, does it make sense? Or other companies in the same industry showing revenues of equal type or percentages of equal type? What is it with this? Oh, we just have the greatest sales staff. Does that make sense? Auditors need to assess risk factors, and when the risk of fraud is high, they must demand stronger evidence. It's going to be our job as auditors to look at those accounts where risk is high. When you're dealing with cash and very little documentation, how are we going to check for that? That's a tough one, guys. That's where you need to know internal controls are in place. There should never be just one person handling money, bringing in the money, and for a park snowball or the baseball sign up. There needs to be an implementation where there are controls in place, so there are at least two parties and documents to help substantiate the revenues that should be coming in. Computer errors should be viewed as a risk error. Why are there computer errors? Dominant clients can be a problem. Why would dominant clients be a problem? They can be pushy, can't they? They can be pushy. Auditors need to know what motivates management. Is management motivated to make sure they get their stock options and they need that stock price to go up by a certain amount? Is management motivated by their 20% bonus is going to be based on getting a certain increase in sales for the year? Now, in some respects, I don't want to take out the importance of management being motivated or sales being motivated. But the problem is when the motivation is so closely related to a potential way of being creative with the books, it becomes an ability to maybe turn the other cheek. So we're getting to where we're trying to frown on management being motivated by so many stock options as we've seen in the past 20 years, because so much of that has increased the stock price, made a false sense of revenues, and really lined the pockets of management at the expense for a lot of investors once they walk away. Auditors should not assume all people are honest.
Why would you ever assume that?
Well, again, professional skepticism. We need to look. We need to be aware of potentially who could be doing what. Who has access to some assets that could be vulnerable. When fraud risk indicators are discovered, they must be thoroughly investigated. Don't turn the other cheek. You might hate to see what you're going to find, and it might be a long road back, but that's your job. Ultimately, it's much easier to spend the time finding fraud than to show an opinion that is incorrect and the millions of dollars of cost in lawsuits later. Auditors take risks whenever they do not audit. Oh, I put that in. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO, has conducted 3 major studies on the incidence of fraud. The most recent was related to companies during 1998 and 2007. The analysis identified the major characteristics of companies that had committed fraud. The total amount of fraud was more than 120 billion, spread across 300 companies. The median size of company perpetrating the fraud rose tenfold to 100 million between 1998 and 2007. And the scary part, there was heavy involvement in the fraud by the CEO or CFO, with at least one of them named in 89% of the cases, guys. Scary. This isn't just fraud that's occurring at lower levels. This is fraud where the head honchos are involved. The most common fraud involved revenue recognition, 60% of the cases during the latest period compared to 50% in previous periods. What are we talking about when we state revenue recognition? Manipulating the financial statements, recording revenue probably earlier than it needs to be recorded, or maybe even just falsifying transactions, period. 1/3 of the companies changed auditors during the latter part of the fraud, compared to less than half of the amount of auditors changes taking place with non-fraud companies. Another big warning sign, when you're going to be taking on a new company and they've just changed auditors, do you understand the importance of wondering why and of speaking with the previous auditors to discuss what's going on? Some fraud risk indicators from prior COSO studies did not distinguish between the fraud and non-fraud companies in the most recent study, likely because these elements were not really imposed previously, where after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, they're required to check for internal controls also. The majority of the frauds took place at companies that were listed on the over-the-counter market rather than those listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So basically what's technically happening with the companies on the New York Stock Exchange, they're under greater scrutiny because the PCAOB is now requiring much more responsibility with management and the directors of a company, that they are going to be personally responsible for the any material misstatements. There's time in jail for being a part of this. So they've truly upped the consequences and the scrutiny for auditors to check their internal controls, to sign off on things. It's just making it, number one, more costly to conduct audits because there's more involved with it. And ultimately, there's more we need to do now to gain the public's trust back. Guys, I think I'm going to stop here and we'll start off